a serious participant in reconciling the damage that we've done to God's creation with God, right? If God's creation belongs to God, then we've defiled it. It's all gonna end. So who gives a fuck? I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
So now here's where you say your name.
Right. Hey, I'm Scott.
Hi, I'm Mark.
All right. So if you haven't guessed, we're talking about the end times, baby.
Oh, no.
I know you're loving it. I know you don't have to hide it. I know you're loving it.
I
Okay,
only
here-
love it because, like, off camera where you can't see, I have a life-size doll of Tim LaHaye that I kick in the nuts repeatedly whenever we have to talk about the end times. Because-
That's great. All right. So Relevant Magazine. 2/3 of Christians believe we're living in the end times. Quick stats pulled out of the article.
Okay.
4 in 10 Americans believe we're currently now, today, living in the end times. That number also represents 63% of evangelicals. 38% of Christians argue that since the world is in God's hands, there's no need to worry about it.
Really? That's, dumb.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to begin like, okay, point A, how this breaks the church.
Yeah. No. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, before we get to how it breaks the church, can I just rant a little bit?
Oh, by all means, rant away.
All right. So let's start here. When in the world did go out into the world and make believers become sit at your home, make as much money as you can, give that money to a super PAC so that they can force your religious views on me? When did this happen? That church stopped being a relationship thing, a retail thing, person to person, and just become about winning. Like, I just want my religious, cultural, behavioral way of life to apply to anybody. And if I've got to do it through laws, I've got to put people in internment camps, that doesn't seem to be off the menu either these days.
My best
I just don't get
response is 1980.
Yeah.
But
That seems to be when kind of it started. Like, I know what you're getting at. Yeah, that seems to kind of be when it seriously started to become like a win at all costs kind of thing. But it's like, it is so fundamentally contrary to everything I've been taught from the pulpit since I started seriously attending church in 1998. Like, everything I've been taught by a pastor has been about reconciliation to one another, about loving one another, about loving God, about finding pathways to connection, and about rejecting anything that divides. And so I'm having a hard time. Like, so that's what, 1998, 2008? Like, that's in the span of 20 years. We've gone from mostly kind of a feel-good theology that's all about like a warm, loving, my buddy Jesus, therefore we should be all friends and family to each other, to being a church that's like, is just unapologetically like, we want what we want. And if it screws everybody else, then so be it.
yeah, so I'm going to say
Yeah.
the United States has a very queer history when it comes to just apocalyptic doomsaying.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had so many just sects of Christianity or cults. I mean, if you want to call Jehovah's Witnesses a cult, but like,
Right.
and not even just like groups that are considered to be heretical by mainstream Christians, but it's like for the longest time, any understanding of the end times, whatever that meant, was really just a very tiny part of what you might think as a Christian. It wasn't important when the end might come because it's in God's hands. And then in the 19th century, so the 1800s, like moving forward, there was just this kind of like acceleration, right? Of like various branches of Christianity. You had, dispensationalism, premillennialism started to take off. And premillennialism is like, for anybody who doesn't know, that's just basically when we talk about end times and people believe that we're in the end times, like, you're really talking about premillennialism, which isn't ubiquitous among all Christians. But then I felt like, just in my life experience and then what I've been able to read from like the few years before I could really remember anything, it really was like the 70s and forward when like there became this kind of obsession with the end, right? Maybe it was just the Cold War. I don't know how much of my life was just in my youth where I was told you're going to get blown up by nuclear fireball. It's like, this is going to happen. And Reagan had this kind of obsession with the end time. And he really kind of brought it into much more the mainstream, it felt. So that,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that, like by the time I was in high school, that was just kind of a thing that had begun to really permeate evangelical Christianity in this country because evangelicals loved Reagan.
Yeah.
And this is not meant to, whatever his politics, doesn't matter. It's just like he, as an individual himself, he was an evangelical Christian, and he was just really obsessed with the end times.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question here?
Yes.
So, you and I, if we were part of the early church, being retaught these things from these letters being written about a kingdom is coming. So you need to sell your stuff, and you need to care for those around you, because a kingdom is coming, and these things that you cherish in the here and now mean nothing in the eternal kingdom to come. So if you were a person 2,000 years ago hearing that message, would you have listened to that message metaphorically, or would you have heard Jesus say, okay, the end times is coming, like it's coming, and I should prepare, and I need to make changes in my life and my status and the things I own, because things are going to get real, and they're going to get real soon?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, because so the early church, the church like within the first century, right? You know, we have things written by Paul where he's addressing issues of the end times.
Yeah.
And he's not saying like, look, Jesus isn't going to come back. He's just saying, look, we need not to worry about this. And there's a technical term for this, which I'm not going to use.
Right.
But like it was this, the church in the early time really did have this vibe of an imminent return of Jesus in judgment.
Right.
But then it became more and more apparent the actual phase of Jesus's return and like the final judgment was going to be a deferred thing.
Yeah, and if you were to roughly date that phase, when would that phase have kind of become the standard thinking?
I mean, we're talking within like the first century of the church.
So like within the first century, there was kind of a gigantic shift towards it not being imminent anymore.
Yeah, because like we already saw that transformation happening in the scriptures that we have. For Paul dates to around the mid 60s or so. And so even by then, right, the church had been around for like 30 years at that point. And like we're already seeing that transformation. And then by the time we get to like the early church fathers, like there really is a sense like the church is here to stay for some amount of time. And then the various beliefs on like how to interpret, you know, the scriptures that we have, yada, yada, yada. These things kind of all followed. Some of it came early on, some of it came later. But then what we have now is like the scene we have now is really a much more modern creation.
Yeah.
Even though some of it was already established theology. Sorry, go.
Right. No. That's really all very helpful and informative. So how far are we removed from Jesus when Revelation comes to be?
Okay, so the early dating for the writing of Revelation, as we're talking about 60 years after the crucifixion.
Okay.
And some people will put it into the early 2nd century, but most Christians are going to say it was probably like, somewhere in the 90s.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, because for people who like to think about living in the end times, which I am not one, full disclosure, I've said this many times on this show, all you have to do is, it's a simple math equation, right? The number of people who told you that the end is about to die divided by the number of times that the world has actually ended, right? That's all you have to do. Because what's the number in the denominator? It's 0, right? And what do we call what's on the other side of that equal sign when you do that equation?
0.
It's undefined. It's undefined, right? So so that's kind of where I am on this. But I find it interesting that people who do think that we are in this living in the end times, they don't act like we are. You know what I mean? Like, okay, the world's about to end. It's all about to come crashing down. You've got $5-6 million in your 401k. What are you going to do with it? Oh, well, I've got my will, and my will says that it's going to go on to my kids and their kids. Well, that doesn't seem like a very good use of money if the world is about to end. You've got this ginormous house. You've got 2 cars. You've got a white picket fence. You've got 2.5 children. You've got a dog and an aquarium. Like, what are you doing with all this stuff if the world is about to end? And so you don't even need to ask them about their theology or ask them even about philosophy. All you have to do is look at the way they live versus what they say they believe about the end times to kind of know that there's like this weird, somebody's not being honest about what they believe, or somebody is actually delusional about what's going on around them.
Yeah, there's in the Star Trek original series, there's some great theology in one of the episodes, where you have this character just known as Gorgon, who has a bunch of children surrounding him, and they basically do his bidding. And there's this phrase that repeats over and over in the episode, and that's, as you believe, so shall you do.
Yeah.
And that is just wonderful Christian theology right there, because we know what you believe based on what you're doing with it.
Yep.
And it's funny that some people, that they will hoard wealth for themselves, many lifetimes for the wealth, but then they'll say, well, but like this is really the end times, or the end times are almost here, as an excuse for not taking care of the planet.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, no, you're a hypocrite. And then just like to say like, well, hey, if the end is imminent, we shouldn't worry about taking care of anything. Well, it's like I walk in the bathroom and say, okay, who pooped on the floor and why? And you said, well, I pooped on the floor. I'm like, well, why did you do do that? And you're like, well, because like we're moving tomorrow. What does it matter? It's like, that's not the point.
Yeah.
We need to
absolutely.
take care of this thing while we are here. And so we should do that. So that's what kind of drives me wacky about some of these people, just like how it becomes an excuse for not caring and doing the thing that we're supposed to do. Like scripturally, we're supposed to take care of the planet.
Hey, I'm glad you just said that, because if you look at my screen right now, I'm going to put up those scriptures, or some of them. I'm going to put up 7 of them, as a matter of fact, of scriptures that specifically tell us to take care of the planet. And so I think this is a good segue to go into talking about how this breaks the church, because my number one thing about how this breaks the church is you cannot claim a Bible whose authority eclipses all other sources of authority and then disregard what it teaches us. It teaches us how to think, and it teaches us what to do. So if you're going to disregard what it says, how much authority does it really have?
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add a corollary to that, is that anybody looking in from the outside who sees us going on and on about how the Bible is true and about how it's inerrant or infallible or whatever language somebody's going to use,
Yeah.
if they should choose to, right? It's like, and then you just refuse to actually do what it clearly states.
Right.
Like you cannot do better work for the devil than that.
Absolutely. 100% agree. All right, second way it breaks the church. What listener takes a message of hope and redemption and reconciliation seriously when the messengers have clearly run out of all those things, right? The sky is falling, but have hope. Right?
Mm-hmm.
If our jobs is to go out into the world and love one another and love God, it's kind of hard to send that message when the way you're acting kind of sends the message that the love and patience of God has run out.
Oh yeah, like there's a real like us them kind of quality to this, right? Where it's like I'm saved, but you're not. It's like people want to be able to feel good about themselves by imagining just how much everybody else around them is going to burn.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, let me throw an idea by you here. I'm going to take my third how it breaks the church. I'm going to reword it a little bit.
Okay.
You tell me if I'm way off the mark, because I might be, and I'm willing to admit it. Let's talk about these great Christian leaders, thought leaders, Spurgeon. Who else do you want to add to the list of great Christian thought leaders?
I'll say N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright. For all of you modern fundamentalists, John Piper, whatever.
Yeah.
Whoever your favorite big thinker is of your age. What authority, like how do we teach eternal truths in big thinker kind of ways if we can't even think our ways out of the small problems?
Mm-hmm.
And so not that climate change is a small problem, but it's a problem that only gets bigger, right? So the longer we kick the can down the road, the bigger the problem gets. And so like, how seriously am I supposed to take you as a thinker of all that is spiritual, all that is holy, all that is lovely, all that is eternal, if you're not willing to sit down and take a serious shot of like how to steward our land here and now?
Yeah, I can't really argue with that point, because I feel like when we either A, kick the can, or B, deny the can exists, when it objectively does, we lose our authority to teach.
Yeah.
At the same time, I can't remember where Paul says this, but like he's talking about how, there are false teachers out there.
Yeah.
But you know what? The message of Christ is being preached, even if only by accident, and that's at least something.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the attitude we need to have on this one. Is just like, well, at least they are preaching the gospel, if only accidentally.
Yeah.
But yeah, like actions do speak louder than words. As trite as it is to say that, I'm going to believe what you do before I believe what you say.
Yeah. I was listening to an interview with Ben Shapiro, of all people. I know you love Ben Shapiro. He's your favorite and mine.
Oh, yeah.
But it was an interview where like he wasn't doing his own show, where he tends to be that guy that you hate, right? He's very aggressive and kind of ill-mannered. Like he was doing an interview on somebody else's show, and he was actually quite charming, and like he was relaxed and in a good mood and making jokes, and it was actually a nice interview.
Mm-hmm.
And he made a point that I actually thought was actually a very good point. Americans in general, we're not very good at preventing catastrophes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we didn't prevent Nazi Germany, things like that. But Americans on the whole we have a really good track record of fixing problems once they appear. Right. And so as a man of faith, he was kind of making the case that even though we're doing a completely horrible job at managing climate change and preventing that unimaginable day that's coming, like someday that day will come and humans will finally get serious about it and then do whatever it takes to fix the problem. So that was an interesting perspective. I'm just wondering, Ben Shapiro, he is a Jewish man by faith. So I'm wondering if there's any Old Testament examples of that being an appropriate way to think about things. Just kind of relax. Like, I know there's always a part of faith that says, God's got his hands on it. Jesus, take the wheel, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But is that really actually a sound theological way to think about the problems of the world. Is you don't have. We may not be able to prevent it, but we can fix it.
Oh gosh, yeah, like that's a toughie, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, just going through the Old Testament in terms of what's taught there. I mean, it's just there's
Yeah.
a lot to go through in the Torah.
Yeah.
But the rule is like the moment you're aware something is a problem, you need to do something
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
And so it really feels disingenuous of Ben Shapiro to say that, like, well, maybe we can't prevent a problem, but we can fix it. It's like, actually, you can often prevent a problem by identifying when things are going off the rails in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think to say, like, yeah, that we're great about fixing problems is only works if the problem is not intractable. And believe it or not, there are problems that are intractable.
Right. Yeah.
It's like
Right,
once
like,
gangrene sets in on your foot's being amputated. You can't fix that.
Right. But like I didn't bring that up for us to rake Ben through the coals as much as I would love to, right?
Yeah.
Like nothing would make me happier than to do that. But just to kind of say, look, if that's our thinking, we can prevent it or we can fix it, so let's just wait till we fix it, then we as the church are not a serious participant in this discussion of climate change then.
No.
Is kind of where I'm going, right? And that's probably a good place to start, is we might just kind of want to get off our collective butts and become a serious participant in reconciling the damage that we've done to God's creation with God, right? If God's creation belongs to God, then we've defiled it. And maybe we ought to get serious about the spiritual aspect. And if we get serious about the spiritual aspect, we will get serious about healing this earth.
Yeah. And, I think just to add on top of that a little bit, we as Christians need to be concerned about what's causing the problems that we see. Whatever that problem is. Our entire point of our podcast, right, is like we're trying to find out, like, what's the root cause of this problem in, like, this headline that we're seeing.
Yeah.
So it's like, that is so important. And of course, we thankfully at least claim belonging to an infinite God who will not forsake us in the end, but will also empower us in the present.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like, and then what is the point of the empowerment if nobody actually picks it up and does something with it?
Exactly. Yeah.
So, super. Yeah. Excellent point. Excellent point. And I think that your word on that is probably going to be our final word for the tonight. So listen, everybody, we're Church is Lame. This podcast exists to talk about the crazy, stupid things that Christians do that break the entire body. Mark and I, we get together every week. We make these episodes so we can have a repository of examples so that when people ask, why don't people go to church anymore? Why is the church less relevant? Those kind of questions, the answer is not going to be, oh, because young people just don't care anymore. Or like silly kind of throw off reasons, but a real repository of real stupid things churches do week after week after week that make people go, no, thank you. So that's what we do. And we would love for you to be part of the discussion. Are Christians taking climate change seriously, or are we just kind of kicking the can down the road? We'd love for you to, leave your comments and, click those thumbs up and thumbs down and subscribe buttons and all those things you can click. And if you're listening to the podcast, and by the way, if you have Apple Podcasts, please subscribe to Church's Lame on Apple Podcasts. Would really love some help with the algorithm. But shoot us an email, churcheslamepodcast@gmail.com.
And just in case you're one of those people for whom the Old Testament is the Bible, Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yunecha, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. Amen.